Psalm 119 is known as the Giant Psalm because it's 176 verses long. It reads like an acrostic poem, so it's broken up into 22 stanzas of about 8 verses, and each of those have a title, and the title is a letter from the Hebrew alphabet. So it goes through the A to Z of the Hebrew alphabet, and each stanza starts with the corresponding letter as well. It reads like a love song to God and his law as well. For example, your decrees are the theme of my song wherever I lodge, verse 54. The earth is filled with your love, Lord. Teach me your decrees, verse 64. How sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth, verse 103. So all but 4 of the lines of this huge psalm refer to the Torah. They use different synonyms. The psalmist describes it as God's law, his command, his decrees, his word, his teaching. But on first look, it sounds as though the psalmist is loving God's law, and that is all he is focused on. But while the Torah is central to the psalm, it's not what the psalmist is compelling us to put our hope in. You see, the psalmist believes that obedience to God's word, to the Torah, is the basic expectation of someone who loves and follows God, because it allows us to understand him deeper. So this psalm is actually a prayer to God about life with God. The psalmist addresses the young in verse 9. He urges the reader to follow God's word and obey him, to find delight and rejoice in God through the Torah. And then in the following stanzas, he continues to elaborate on how God's word and a relationship with God is a lifelong endeavor. He says that God's statutes are his counselors, verse 24, and that when he is weary with sorrow and his life is laid low in the dust, he chooses a way of faithfulness, verse 30. That God's word is a lamp for his feet, a light for his path, that's verse 105. And then in verse 152, the psalmist speaks as though he is someone who has been following God's word for a long time now. He says, long ago I learned from your statutes that you established them to last forever. It's not just the young that he addresses in the psalm. For the psalmist, following God is a lifelong commitment, and he continues to learn from God's word, and he continues to obey God faithfully. We see that he praises God all day long as well. In verse 164, he says, 7 times a day I praise you for your righteous laws. So the psalmist here makes a direct link between meditating and obeying God's word with enjoying a relationship with God. Secondly, the psalmist proclaims that living according to God's command helps us to live the way that God had intended. So 16 times throughout the psalm, the psalmist talks about the verb to live. In verses 37 and 40, for example, the psalmist calls on God's word to preserve his life. But we cannot conclude that the psalmist equates keeping God's commands with living a prosperous life. Because also throughout this psalm, the psalmist recognizes that he is living in a hostile world. He faces suffering and persecution. He talks about wicked people wanting to come against him. In verses 71 and 72, he says that it was good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. The law from your mouth is more precious to me than thousands of pieces of silver and gold. And then in verse 81, he says, my soul faints with longing for your salvation, but I have put my hope in your word. He continues to live in obedience, trusting in God's word and trusting that his life belongs to the sovereign God. It's not that obedience to God and his word takes the psalmist out of his situation, but it helps him to understand how he can live faithfully in life, knowing that God is the one who is ultimately in control and will ultimately deliver him. He uses God's word to navigate through life as a faithful servant of the living God. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, he says that we're not justified by works, but we're justified by faith. So once we've read that in the New Testament, does that render Psalm 119 redundant? Because we know that only Jesus could live this fully faithful life and live in complete obedience to the law? I don't think so. In fact, I don't think that in the Old Testament or the New Testament does it say that you can be justified purely by works. And even in this example here of Psalm 119, the psalmist clearly loves God's word. He loves the Torah, but he recognizes that he has fallen short and he is in need of God's salvation, not of his own. So we see this clearly in the last stanza of Psalm 119. In verses 173 to 176, it's God who is the one who delivers, and the psalmist longs for God's salvation. Even though the psalmist clearly loves God's word and his commands, he recognizes that he has fallen short. The last verse says, "I have strayed like a lost sheep. Seek your servant, for I have not forgotten your commands." The psalmist recognizes that he is not righteous. In the beginning of the psalm too, in verse 5, he says, "Oh, that my ways were steadfast in obeying your decrees." And in verse 166, "I wait for your salvation, Lord. I follow your commands." We see clearly at the end of this psalm that the psalmist calls to God and he says, "I have strayed, seek me, God." He calls out to the promised Messiah, the Good Shepherd. And of course, we have the blessing of the Gospels, and we know that Jesus himself is that promised Messiah. He describes himself as the Good Shepherd in John chapter 10, verse 11. And he says that the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. While the psalmist has a great understanding of the Torah, he has an even deeper understanding of his need for salvation by God's deliverance and God's grace. So, if you have time this morning, it'd be helpful to read Psalm 119 alongside the Beatitudes. Because in this we see in Psalm 119, in the first two verses, it starts off with, "Blessed are those, happy are those who keep God's commands and who walk in ways that are righteous." And similarly, Jesus picks up that same language in Matthew chapter 5 in his Sermon on the Mount, where he said, "Blessed are those who do not live for the short and momentary things in this life." He's teaching his disciples to live their lives in a way that is faithful, with their eyes fixed on the eternal kingdom that is set before us. And so let us this morning be people who reflect on God's word and keep his commands, because we're not saved by our works, we're saved by faith and by grace alone, but we can live faithfully and obediently now, knowing that God is the one who delivers, and we're waiting on him to finish the work that he has started. And that's what this psalm is about. It's about living faithfully in relationship with God.